Welcome to the presentation on summative assessment. There will be a brief, ungraded summative assessment at the end of this presentation.
I wanted to start the meeting just by thanking everyone for coming out to our first assessment committee meeting of the 2016 year. And I wanted to welcome some of our new committee members. And I thought one of the best ways to welcome one of our new members and the people who are watching this online, we could talk a little bit about our personal feelings on why we summatively assess student learning.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question, Anna. As an institution, one of the reasons that it's important for our department to summatively assess students is because summative assessments provide our department and provide the university with evidence of how well students have achieved the given learning objectives in a course. We can also look at the results of student assessments to determine the overall success of our academic program.
I'd like to add that it's important for us to know whether we are going to pass, whether we're going to fail, whether we're going to give a student a high mark or a low mark, and so we can use assessments to make those determinations since it compares all the students together.
Yeah. And building off that, it's also important for predicting a student's success in other courses or future employment.
I think it might also motivate students and provide them direction with their studying. But, on the other hand, do tests take away from learning? Are students not learning deeply because they're so concerned about what's on their tests?
Yeah, wow. Well, what a start to the meeting. So let's get into the topics for the day.
So Rachel, I think you're on the right track with something about some of the issues with learning and summative assessment. I recently read this article by Thompson and Falchikov, and they outlined some of the issues that summative assessment has impacting student learning. So for example, too many assessments are encouraging a level of surface learning rather than deep learning because students feel like they're just jumping from test to final project and not really grasping what the instructors want them to grasp, and they're just focused on what's going to be tested. And some students just really lack the time management skills, and they adopt unhealthy behaviors so that they're cramming at the last minute for some of these really high-stakes tests rather than spreading out their time management over the course of an entire academic term. A lot of students just seem more concerned about their grades than what they're learning. And some students that they interviewed suggested that it might be better just to have routine assessments regularly as topics change throughout the course rather than just one big summative assessment that tells us how well they did in the entire course. So I think it's important that we really consider the learning outcomes as we design the assessments that we incorporate into our coursework.
Speaking of learning outcomes, I wanted to talk to the committee a little bit about the centrality of learning objectives to designing assessments. Before one can align learning outcomes to assessments, teachers have to identify the desired outcomes or learning objectives for a course or program. Learning objectives range in complexity depending on the nature of the subject matter of the class and the approach that an instructor takes to teaching and learning. Two well-known frameworks that categorize learning objectives based on their complexity are Bloom's taxonomy and the structure of observed learning outcomes, or sometimes known as SOLO. This slide illustrates Bloom's framework, which was developed by an examiner at the University of Chicago in the 1950s to help develop banks of test questions. In Bloom's framework, which is shown here as it was revised in 2000, the simplest, lowest cognitive level of learning outcomes is displayed on the left-hand side of the screen, and the outcomes become more complex and abstract as one moves to the right. Just to give an example, a traditional course that focuses on the transmission of information from instructor to student would have relatively simple learning outcomes, such as remembering and understanding course material. In contrast, a course that emphasizes the importance of interactive approaches to learning and the development of critical thinking skills likely would have relatively complex learning objectives. Objectives, for example, that are linked to the application and analysis of concepts, to the evaluation of positions, or even to the creation of solutions to problems. To summarize, Bloom's framework of learning outcomes is a tool that not only helps educators develop test questions, it also helps them design their courses in a way that fosters higher level learning. I also wanted to talk a little bit about aligning assessments with learning objectives. It's very important to do this. From a student perspective, it would be fundamentally unfair, not to mention upsetting and stressful, if the assessments for a course bore no relation to what was actually addressed in class. The graphic in this slide illustrates how the alignment of learning objectives, instruction, and assessment operate like a feedback loop. Assessment results provide an instructor with information on whether course learning objectives are being achieved, and if not, how students can improve their work or how the instructor can improve her instruction. In this sense, well-designed assessments are a source of evidence that can guide both the instructor and students.
So, Karen, I want to come back to what you discussed about Bloom's taxonomy. How do you deal with the fact that as you get more complex in learning objectives, how do you deal with the concept of consistency and reliability in your grading?
Well, Rachel, I know that you're something of an expert on rubrics, and in fact, the answer to your question is I use rubrics to score student assessment.
You know, I'm not really a fan of rubrics. I think it kind of just puts students into a box and doesn't really assess them as a whole student.
Could you talk a little more about what rubrics even are? I mean, I never use them, so I'm completely in the dark on this one.
Sure. When creating a rubric, it's important to keep in mind the criteria that you want students to demonstrate in the assignment and how those criteria relate to your intended learning outcomes. You then need to create markers of quality, such as A, B, and C, to evaluate whether students have achieved those criteria. Here is an example of a rubric that could be used to evaluate this video. As you can see, the quality markers are excellent, good, and poor, and the areas being evaluated are content, organization, and video design. Each sector defines the expectation for the video. It is best practice to give the rubric to students in advance so that they have a clear understanding of the expectations for the assignment. A study by Reddy and Androdny showed that 88% of students valued rubrics when received in advance, but only 10% valued them when received along with their graded assignment.
Well, thanks so much for that explanation, Rachel. Now I feel like I know a little bit more about rubrics.
And I kind of wanted to move the conversation towards just a little bit of a discussion about the idea of practical assessment, because it's something that I know is very common in the medical field, but it's not something that you see as frequently with undergraduate students in not really practical fields.
So I'm not really familiar with practical assessments. Can you explain them to me?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to just give kind of an overview. Okay. So when most people think of summative assessment, their minds probably think of traditional summative assessment measures such as final exams, term papers, or portfolio projects. Traditional summative assessment methods typically measure a student's ability to memorize facts. Practical assessment, on the other hand, measures the student's ability to perform certain skills and the likelihood a student has learned these skills that can be applied in the real world or in future courses. Practical assessment methods are very common in medical school. Some examples of practical summative assessment in medical school are OSCEs, which measure a student's ability to perform skills they learned in the real world in a controlled environment with standardized patients. Medical students also receive end-of-rotation performance evaluations, which assess the student's clinical performance on their rotation by faculty members. A final example is video recording of skills. Students are recorded performing skills in a simulated environment and evaluated later by a faculty member on their ability to perform the task at hand. Yeah, and I initially just started researching how the medical school does it because I think in the future the way that I see assessment going for undergraduates should be more in line with this practical assessment, so we can see how these students in more of the liberal arts field can be practicing things for future careers rather than just focusing on their ability to write a good essay or memorize facts.
That's a great point, Anna.
All right, well, thanks everyone for a great discussion on assessment. Unfortunately, we have to get back to work, but we'll continue another time. Thanks everyone. Have a
See
good
you
day.
next
Thank
time.
you.
Bye.